The U.S. Army Corps of Engineers has been working on an initiative called Engineering with Nature. It all started in 2010. And this is the EWN Podcast. EWN is developing and implementing nature-based solutions for water and infrastructure projects. It's bringing together a growing international community of scientists, engineers, and researchers from all kinds of disciplines that are committed to harnessing the power of nature to solve problems. The EWN Podcast tells their stories. Now here's your host, Sarah Thorne of Decision Partners.
Our guest is a world-renowned scientist, a climate communicator, and a passionate advocate for climate equity. She's a climate ambassador whose message on climate change is one of hope. In fact, in 2019, she was named one of the United Nations Champions of the Earth in the Science and Innovation category. She has dedicated her life to motivating action on climate change every day. Welcome to the EWN Podcast. Jeff King, National Lead of the Engineering with Nature program, and I are absolutely thrilled to welcome our guest, Katharine Hayhoe, Chief Scientist of the Nature Conservancy.
That's right. We are so excited to have Katharine with us today. We've been looking forward to it for quite some time. Katharine, I am personally inspired by your work and all of your accomplishments. In addition to being the chief scientist for the Nature Conservancy, an organization, by the way, that I greatly admire, you are a renowned atmospheric scientist, a Paul Whitfield Horn Distinguished Professor, and an endowed chair in public policy and public law at Texas Tech University. And you're also a brilliant advocate for tackling challenges associated with climate change. So Sarah and I are thrilled to have you here and welcome you to the podcast.
Well, thank you so much, Jeff and Sarah. I am so pleased to be with you here today.
As it turns out, we certainly did have a lot to talk about. So we're going to do something special. We're going to bring you 3 episodes with Katharine so we can cover a whole range of topics that we know will be interesting and stimulating for you, our listeners. So let's get started. Welcome to Season 7, Episode 9. Our conversation begins with Katharine's personal story, which I just love. She was born in Toronto, Canada, as was I, and started her academic career at the University of Toronto studying astrophysics. Her journey led her to becoming one of the most recognized and influential climate scientists in the world.
Well, I can tell you that that was not my career goal. I had no idea that that was what was going to be happening to me over time. But I grew up in a home where science was always front and center. My grandmother had a degree in science education, and although she didn't work outside the home, she raised all of her 8 children with a respect and passion for understanding the natural world. My dad then became a science teacher, and then later the science coordinator for the Toronto Board of Education. And so I grew up with the idea that science was the coolest thing you could possibly study. I mean, who doesn't want to understand why the grass is green or why the sky looks blue or why polar bear's skin is actually black, not white? So I was indoctrinated, you could say, from a very early age, and I knew I wanted to study science. But when I went to university, the science that first caught my eye was the science of how on this planet, which is a relatively insignificant planet in the scheme of the universe, we are able to design instruments and take observations that reach to the farthest edges of the universe and almost back to the beginning of time. So the field of astrophysics really drew me because of the discoveries that still remain to be made. In fact, they continue to be made every day. But I was almost finished my undergraduate degree. I was already working on doing research, looking at variable stars and galaxy clustering around quasars and all kinds of fun things like that, when I needed one extra class to finish my degree. And I looked around and there was this brand new class on climate change over in the geography department. And I thought, well, that looks interesting. Why not take it? So I did. And that was where I learned, first of all, that climate science was the same science I'd been learning in my physics and astronomy classes. I'd been taking classes on cloud physics and planetary atmospheres, and that was the exact same physics that we use to model the climate system. I also learned that climate change is much more urgent and imminent than I thought. And this was back then. Imagine where we are today. So I still thought of it as a future issue that we would care about in the future. But I realized back when I was taking those classes that it was already happening now. And then what really shifted my perspective and what led me to completely change fields and end up doing a master's and a PhD in atmospheric science was when I found out that climate change affects us all, but it doesn't affect us all equally. It is profoundly unfair, affecting the people in the communities right here in the US or in Canada, as well as on the other side of the world, that have done the least to contribute to the problem. And so that, to me, is why I became a climate scientist, because I felt if I had serendipitously, so to speak, the skill set you need to work on this urgent global issue that affects every aspect of our lives on this planet, if I have those abilities and those privileges, I need to be using them to make a difference. And so that's why I decided to become a climate scientist. And as they say, the rest is history.
Well, this is just extraordinary. And I'm sitting here thinking, boy, are we lucky you went down the road you did, because you have become such a powerful voice out there, and just how you're finding this intersection of science with social equity and ensuring that everybody understands the gravity of this situation. So just super fortunate to have you out there being an advocate and a voice.
Absolutely. I want to talk about, Katharine, how and why you took on the role of chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy. You did that in 2021. Tell us about that, and tell us, what does the chief scientist at the Nature Conservancy do?
Well, that is a very good question. It's a question of actually the second part I've been answering myself the last 2 years. So as you can tell, I am very, very passionate about applied science. We need to understand how our world works. We need to understand how our actions and our choices shape and affect and impact our world, which in turn affects us. And then I believe we need to do something about it. And so that's where the Nature Conservancy comes in. TNC is a science-based organization that uses science to inform its decisions that are decisions on the ground to preserve the land and the water, and I would add the air, on which all life depends, working in all 50 states, in Canada, in 78 additional countries, to make a difference on the ground. And we have some very ambitious goals. And when I was being recruited to TNC, these goals were what really helped me see this is an organization that wants to make a difference. They have goals related to the protection and conservation of fresh water, enough rivers to wrap around the globe, of land area, twice the size of India, of ocean area, because of course 70% of our planet is ocean, and over 1 billion people depend on ocean as their primary source of food and the driver of their economy. But then we also have some very ambitious climate goals to prevent 1 billion tons of carbon emissions, to invest in the lives of the most vulnerable people who are being impacted by increasing climate extremes, and to ensure water and food availability for the poorest in the world. So this combination of understanding that it's not about sort of setting nature apart and conserving nature for its own sake, but we are part of nature. And if we don't invest in people, we are not going to be able to protect the resources on this planet that actually provide the air we breathe and the water we drink and the food we eat. So that practical application of science and the dual focus on how people are part of nature and we need to support both, that's what really drew me to the Nature Conservancy. So what does the chief scientist do? Well, it turns out that we have over 1,000 scientists and science staff in, like I said, 80 different countries around the world. And my vision and my view of the chief scientist is, first of all, to support and resource all of our scientists so that they can perform up to the top of their ability. At universities, scientists take so much for granted: journal article subscriptions, seed funding, computational access. At a nonprofit, it's very different. We have phenomenal scientists who could step into academia or research institutions at any level, and they need the same level of support and resourcing, and we need more. We need connectivity. We need to make sure that we're not reinventing any wheels or making the same mistake more than once. Making a mistake once is great. Making the same mistake twice, not so much. And so connecting our scientists and building a sort of an ecosystem of learning where we're connected and learning from each other and from our partners. Because the Nature Conservancy works with partners in every state and around the world, nonprofits, other NGOs, government entities, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, of course, is a huge partner of ours, universities and research centers, communities and cities. We work with all of these organizations, and we're often resourcing the science for them. So just making sure that we have what we need to build that connectivity and that knowledge, and then to share what we're learning with everyone else, because we can't accomplish our goals alone. The only way we're going to do it is by working together.
Katharine, I think what you have just described really resonates for me. Certainly, I've been tracking on the Nature Conservancy for decades, and I am a huge fan of the Nature Conservancy and their mission and all of the different efforts that they have underway. And you as a chief scientist, the R&D, the focus on science, bringing information to people's attention, so absolutely critical in everything that we do. And to have the Nature Conservancy there as a partner, not only with the Corps of Engineers, but with other academic institutions, other non-governmental organizations, and the private sector, it is huge. Absolutely huge.
And if I may add, somebody might be wondering, well, how do I find out what the Nature Conservancy does? We have a brand new science newsletter that anyone can sign up for. Every month, you'll get an update on the 3 to 4 dozen peer-reviewed scientific papers that our scientists publish every month. You'll get a highlight of some of the top research and activities that we're engaging in, opportunities to get to know our scientists, build collaborations. The newsletter's for anyone who's interested in knowing more about what we do and potentially working, partnering, or collaborating with us.
Oh, that's great. We'll make sure that we put that in the show notes, Katharine. Katharine, we wanted to talk to you as a climate scientist about your thinking about the challenges of climate today. Especially you've written and talked so much about the social inequities. Can you talk about that?
Mm-hmm. As I mentioned, that is really the reason, the final straw on the camel's back, the tipping point for me, that made me decide to become a climate scientist. Mm-hmm. Because the people who are most affected by climate change in many cases are not only the ones who've done the least to cause the problem, they are also the ones whose voices are not being heard in calling for solutions. So let me give you a few examples. In North American cities, research has showed that during a heat wave, lower income neighborhoods can be anywhere from 10 up to 15 degrees Fahrenheit hotter than a high income neighborhood in the same city. And the number one reason for that is lack of nature. Green spaces, trees, parks.
Absolutely.
Significantly cool our urban areas during heat waves. And thanks to historic racist redlining practices, many low-income neighborhoods do not have access to green spaces in their communities. They are also located in areas that are much more prone to flooding. They're in areas where typically air pollution is higher because that's where the factories are sited or that's where the freeways are run through. And so engaging with nature-based solutions not only addresses immediate issues of climate adaptation to heat, it also helps with air pollution and health. It helps with flooding. It provides people with resources, equitable resources they wouldn't already have. Now, let's look at the other side of the world. We have many countries whose carbon footprint, so to speak, is almost negligible. In fact, the richest 1% of people in the world, according to Oxfam, who I serve as a sister of the earth to, the 1% richest, they produce double the carbon emissions, not just through their lifestyle, but through their investments, than the poorest 50% of people on the planet. So you take a country like Malawi, where many people might be small shareholder farmers and they feed their family off the proceeds of their land. A number of years ago, child marriages were outlawed in Malawi. You were not allowed to marry off a daughter, and a woman was not allowed to marry until she was 18. But in recent years, people who work with youth and who work with rural families have seen child marriage rates are actually increasing again, despite the law. And when they ask the families why, they see that it's the droughts, the unseasonable rains, the crop failures that lead many families to a completely untenable choice that no one should ever have to make between the whole family starving or marrying off a daughter as young as 8 or 10 years old. So wherever we look, the injustices of climate impacts are very clear. And at its core, I truly believe that climate change is an issue of justice and equity. And what is climate change other than a failure to love our neighbor as ourselves?
What a great perspective, Katharine. And, we are certainly seeing the effects of climate change now. And I think you've done a wonderful job of explaining to us, how the effects of climate change really do exacerbate these social inequities that you were just talking about. But what I find interesting, though, Katharine, and again, have been listening to you and watching your sort of track here on this topic for quite some time, your message is not one of despair. Rather, it's one of hope. And I think that is so incredibly important. And so, we're interested in hearing more about your perspective on this and that message of hope and your call to combating climate change.
So I believe that we could have the best science in the world, but if people don't understand why it matters to them and they don't understand what we can do about it, we're going to do nothing.
That's right.
I think of
So
this
true.
as, yes. I think of this as the head to heart to hands gap. So in our heads, we know global temperature is rising. Humans are responsible. The ice sheets are melting. Sea level rise is accelerating. Animals are facing extinction. Our own well-being is at risk. We know these things. In fact, around the world, the vast majority of people are worried about climate change. In the U.S., over 2/3 of people are worried. I live in the state of Texas, where 42% of registered Republican voters are worried about climate change. 96% of registered Democrat voters are worried. So we're really reaching a tipping point in terms of the head. The majority of people are worried, but they don't understand how it affects the people, places, and things we love. They haven't made the head-to-heart connection. They still think of it as a future issue, a distant issue, and something that is not on their priority list, whereas in fact, whatever is on our priority list today, I can tell you climate change is already affecting every single thing on that list, whether it's when your children can safely play outside, the insurance rates that you're paying for your home, the quality of the air that you're breathing, or even the price you're paying for your groceries. It's all being affected by climate change and fossil fuels, make no mistake. But most people haven't made that head-to-heart connection yet. So that's the first part of it. I would say, in addition to hope, I have a message of awareness, understanding why it matters to us. Because if we don't understand there's a problem that matters to us, why would we want to fix it? So that I think of as the first 50% of the message. We have to make that head-to-heart connection. But then we could have the whole world worried, but if they don't know what to do about it, they'll do nothing. And that's exactly what we see in the US. 2/3 of people are worried, but only 8% are activated. So what's the biggest step we can take? Is it to make all the not worried people worried or to make all the worried people activated? I personally think there's the biggest bang for the buck on option B. So that's where the hope comes in. The hope is in connecting our heart to our hands. So when we look at the psychology, when we look at the neuroscience, when we look at the social science, it's all clear that when we're faced with the risk, we need something that social psychologist Albert Bandura calls efficacy. And he coined this term back the year I was born. That's how old this concept is, but it's taken a long time for it to filter through to climate communication. And efficacy is the simple idea of, if I do something, could it make a difference? And right now, most people would say, no, I feel hopeless, helpless, and I have no idea what to do. That is 50% of people's perspective in the US. And I would say it's probably more. They just don't want to admit it. Mm-hmm. So that's why making that heart to hands connection is so important, helping people understand how they can make a difference. Because where do we find our hope? We find it in action. in the action that others are taking, in being aware of what is being done, is being aware of what can be done, and in being engaged in action ourselves.
This is beautiful.
Yeah.
I am so inspired talking to you. This is fantastic.
I think the other thing, Katharine, is, and you say this in your talks and things that I've been listening to and reading about you, being able to empower people to take action where they are, where they live. I think, when we were growing up, it was very hard to do anything about climate change, which was identified for us as polar bears in the Arctic. But you bring the message right down to people where they are, in their homes, in their churches, in their families, in their communities. Talk a little bit about that, because I think that that's really fundamental to your message of hope.
It is. That message, like I said, of awareness of the risk, and then also the potential possibility and benefits of actions. So that's the head to heart gap you're talking about there. And in order to bridge it, I have my own weekly newsletter called Talking Climate. And every week I share good news, shaded green, so you can't miss it, about what's happening around the world. Because a big part of what the social science shows us will motivate people to act is understanding we're not alone. There's a lot of other people taking action. And so I think of it as a giant boulder. We often think it's just sitting at the bottom of an impossibly steep hill, and it's only got a few hands on it. It's got Greta Thunberg. She's a very small little girl. It's got Sir David Attenborough. That man is in his 90s and he's still going. It's got Al Gore. He's been pushing on that boulder for 30 years. But we feel like it hasn't got anybody else there, so why would I even bother adding my hand? But when we realize that giant boulder is already at the top of the hill, it's already rolling down the hill in the right direction. It already has millions of hands on it.
Great analogy, Katharine. So good. And this head to heart to hands, I'm going to remember that. I love how you laid that out and then offered the details associated with each one of those sort of steps and how we get to this point of everybody putting their hands on this boulder and let's move it accordingly. So fantastic.
And that's what that first section of my newsletter talks about every week, some of those hands. And if I had my hand, it will go faster. That's what motivates us to act. So I've got good news in green at the top, and then right next to it underneath, I have not so good news in red. And the not so good news, like you said, Sarah, it's not about polar bears and ice sheets. It's about how climate change is affecting the air that we breathe, how it's affecting children's sports, how it's affecting bananas and chocolate and coffee, how it's affecting things in our life. And then I have the next section in blue, what you can do about it. And every week I have something practical that people can do. And the whole intent of the newsletter, it's called Talking Climate after all, is to give people things that they can talk about with people around them every week. Because the number one thing we can do to kickstart and catalyze action is the thing that 2/3 of Americans are not doing, and that is we're not talking about it. It's such a simple step that we just sort of overlook it. But how do humans ever do anything together without communication? That is the way that we knock over what I think of as the first domino in that long row of dominoes that will lead us to a better future.
Wow. Well, Katharine has given us a lot to think about in terms of what does motivate us to take action on climate change. What are those fundamental values that drive us both personally and professionally? Lots of good food for thought. In the next episode, Jeff and I talk with Katharine about how she's personally making changes and taking action. And we have a fascinating discussion about the critical role nature-based solutions play in addressing climate change. So please join us for Season 7, Episode 10, which drops June 12th. In the meantime, to all of you, thank you so much for listening. We hope you've enjoyed this podcast. We hope that you'll be inspired to talk about climate change. And we sure hope you'll join us again when we talk about engineering with nature.
You've been listening to the EWN podcast, developed by Sarah Thorne and Jeff King, National Lead, Engineering with Nature Initiative, U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. Now, for more information, you can visit our website, engineeringwithnature.org. The EWN podcast is produced by iContact Productions for the Engineering with Nature program within the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. I'm Dave Trafford.